Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you. Great to be with you. Thank you so much to the Kettering Foundation for hosting us today, picking up on the last remarks about solidarity. So appreciated that, Yvonne. We're in a moment where we need all the forms of global democratic solidarity that we can get. And we're in a moment, I say this as someone who spent the past 25 years or so working with and writing about movements around the world that have fought for freedom, democracy, often against autocratic regimes. And one of the seminal findings of that work and my research is that learning from each other across borders, learning the strategies and tactics, understanding both the context we're in, the authoritarian playbook, but importantly also how to fight back effectively, strategically, is one of the most important things we can be doing. So thank you for creating the space with this conference to be able to have that discussion. So I am joined by two premier scholars of democracy and authoritarianism, and we heard in the last presentations about this 2-decade-long or so rise of global authoritarianism, autocratization that is touching all regions of the world. We all know in this room that the authoritarian playbook has been translated into multiple languages and adapted. So we want to talk about how we understand authoritarianism now, both in the United States and around the world. So I want to start with Stephan. You've written extensively about where we are on the clock of authoritarianism, if you will, including a recent op-ed saying we've crossed the threshold into competitive authoritarianism. Dissent has become costly. Institutional restraints are being eliminated. So talk with us, Stephan, about what this means. What is competitive authoritarianism? What are the signs? What should we know?
Sure. First of all, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for organizing this. I could not agree more that of the importance of learning from one another, learning from cases around the world, and the importance, the centrality of democratic solidarity, really, really important. So authoritarianism doesn't look, at least in the West and in Latin America, my region of the world, authoritarianism doesn't look the way that we were sort of brought up looking at it. It's most dictatorships, most autocracies are not military juntas. They're not single-party regimes. In fact, from a distance, if you don't look closely, they can look like democracies. Most authoritarian experiments in the 21st century are led by elected, often freely elected, governments. They do not, they may change the Constitution, they don't throw away the Constitution, they don't ban opposition. What they do is tilt the political playing field. So elections tend to remain. Often they're pretty competitive. But governments will systematically purge and pack the state, the state administration with allies, and then weaponize the state, use state institutions, from the Justice Department to Education Department to the Health Ministry, as weapons against rivals, to punish critics, to bully and harass and intimidate civil business, media, civil society, such that eventually the political playing field is tilted against the opposition. This is Hungary, this is Turkey, this is Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. And as Maria mentioned, I've argued recently, this is beginning to happen in the United States. And it's happening in the United States with a speed and ferocity, I think, that very few of us anticipated. What Trump, it's hard, it's impossible to predict where we're going in the future, but the first 6 months of the Trump administration were much, much more aggressively authoritarian than Orban in Hungary, than Erdogan in Turkey, than Chavez in Venezuela. I'm not saying that we're going to end up like Venezuela, but the first 6 months have been much, much more aggressive than in most other 21st century cases. Really quickly, so with a competitive authoritarian regime, because you do have an elected government, you don't have tanks in the streets, you don't have opposition leaders usually in prison, citizens, particularly citizens who don't pay really close attention, have a hard time identifying whether the regime has even changed. In fact, a decade into competitive authoritarian rule in Hungary and in Venezuela, most Hungarians and Venezuelans believed that they were living under a democracy. And most Americans, if you ask them, will tell you, the Constitution's still there, Trump was elected. This is not an authority. How do you know that the playing field is tilted and that you're living under authoritarianism? There are lots of ways to measure that. The indicator that we suggest using is what's the cost of exercising your constitutional right to oppose the government, right? In a democracy, legal, peaceful opposition, writing an op-ed against the government, organizing or participating in a protest against the government, a legal protest, running as an opposition candidate, funding an opposition candidate, any expression of legal opposition in a democracy should be costless, should be relatively costless. It's our constitutional right to do those things. Under authoritarianism, legal opposition is costly. You risk an investigation, a tax audit, harassment, threats, all kinds of either state or societal threat against you. So if citizens have to think twice, have to think 3 times about engaging in legal acts of opposition, you're no longer living in a fully democratic regime. And as shocking as it is to both say and hear this, I think we're already there in the United States. It is a mild competitive authoritarianism. It is a reversible competitive authoritarianism. But we've crossed the line.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. And something we've been sharing with a lot of groups across the U.S., movement organizations, unions, faith groups, and the like, is that we have crossed the threshold, and we have about 12 to 18 months to prevent kind of a full-on consolidation. Now, that's not precise, but the bottom line is the more consolidated authoritarianism becomes, the harder it is ultimately to reverse. All the more reason for the kind of organizing, mobilization work that needs to happen. So I want to turn to Gábor. So, you've studied similarly illiberal regimes, authoritarianism. Talk to us about your understanding of kind of the democratic backsliding, authoritarian, competitive authoritarianism, and how has this played out practically in Hungary?
Thank you very much for the question, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's really vital to have these kind of conversations. I'm sure you know this bromance between Donald Trump and Viktor Orbán and all the illiberal learning, transatlantic learning going on. I think there's unfortunately less democratic learning going on, so that's why I think this is really so vital. And where I want to continue is the very last part of Steve's remark is like the cost of doing opposition politics or pro-democracy politics in authoritarian regimes. And so this leads me to fear, like how the politics of fear is central to these regimes. So that would be one thing that I would highlight, how illiberalism rests on these various tactics, partly institutional, but also there's this you might call the software of illiberalism, which is about creating this kind of culture of disunity, these imagined moral hierarchies between people that divides people and pits various groups of society against each other in the name of fear. I fear immigrants, various groups, various minorities. The majority fears cultural minorities, sexual minorities. It's at the heart of this kind of illiberal authoritarian politics. And whenever I'm in DC, I always walk around the tidal basin, and there's this FDR quote there at one point where he says, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And that's not just a very strong quote, but also we know how he responded to it with the New Deal agenda. Because the second thing what I wanted to highlight is how this kind of fear is this horrible kind of, the politics of fear is this horrible response to real and existing kind of anxieties that people have. And we need to understand those anxieties. Like if you, whenever I travel around the US, upstate New York or West Virginia or like just general Midwest, I feel so much at home in terms of the being left behind in these areas, that sense, the dilapidated infrastructure, all those things going on. It's very much Eastern Europe in one sense. And that kind of anxiety, real suffering, even like mortality crisis you have in the US, the same happened across Eastern Europe in many countries. So this is like kind of a real suffering that creates anxiety. And then the politics of fear works in that context. So this leads into the third point, which is whether pro-democracy forces, centrist forces have a response to that kind of experience. To begin with, whether they are willing to listen and acknowledge those very real sufferings. Too often, the first response from democratic forces is like kind of dismissal, and I think that's the wrong answer. So you need to kind of validate that kind of suffering and present a kind of a transformative vision, because these days, unfortunately, it's mostly a liberal, radical, populist right that presents itself as this kind of transformative force with a transformative vision. So I think these are the three main components: the kind of the cunning of the liberals, the real anxieties of the population and the frustration with the practice of real existing democracy, and then the failure of democratic forces to respond. These are three critical elements.
No, I appreciate that. And I think maybe before going back to Steve, stay with you, Gábor, just on what this has looked like in Hungary. Because Stephen was talking about this phenomenon of competitive authoritarianism, which is basically tilting the playing field and giving an incumbent advantage. So there are different tactics to give the incumbent an advantage so that it becomes very difficult for opposition forces to win electorally and beyond. So maybe you could talk with us about practically what has this looked like in Hungary? What were the steps that were taken?
Yeah, this description fits really perfectly well the Hungarian situation. I mean, the level, the playing field has been tilted to a degree that it's not impossible, but very hard to get rid of Orbán electorally. And I was elected to the Hungarian parliament the same year when Viktor Orbán was elected back to power, because he was in power in between 1998 and 2002, but back then he governed more or less as a centrist conservative politician. But in 2010, the very first day, he started with this slew of fast-moving legislation, not as fast as Trump is moving, but he was moving very fast. So I remember being in parliament completely paralyzed, not just me, the whole opposition, because so much was happening at the same time. So it's part of the agenda, this kind of shock therapy strategy to paralyze you and open multiple fronts so that you lose your vision and you're completely like always in this reactive mode, being completely bogged down by what the liberal leader is doing. So that's part of the story. Then, of course, we know how he rewrote the constitution, changed the electoral system in a way that favors Fidesz as a political party. I don't want to get lost in the technical details, but the bottom line was to make it very hard for a divided opposition to create a successful political challenger or mount a successful political challenge. He conquered the media in a way that was using the state's regulatory capacities to inflict the costs on media organizations. He gave money to loyal oligarchs to buy up financially suffering media outlets. And over the years, he completely restructured the private media landscape, not just the public broadcasting, which is a completely like a propaganda machine, but even the private media landscape run through his kind of loyalists. So if you, then of course all the independent institutions are run by an Orbán friend or loyalist. So even if there is some clearly visible corruption going on, there's no one that at these institutions at the prosecutor's office who would dare to initiate an investigation. So if you add all these things up, yes, you can freely run at the election, but the chances of you actually beating Orbán is, I mean, it's not impossible because now he's like behind the biggest opposition party, but it's just like a very unfair game.
Exactly. And Stephen, maybe you could share from Latin America kind of what this tilting of the playing field, this competitive authoritarianism has looked like. What are some practical insights from that part of the world?
Well, it's usually a little less systematic than in Hungary, and there's a greater role for, I think, outright corruption and buying off. But the core pattern is the same. you take what was a more or less independent civil service and bureaucracy and judiciary, and you do your best to purge it of professional civil servants, pack it with allies, and then turn what are supposed to be institutions aimed at delivering services or providing security or providing other public goods, and you turn them into partisan weapons, meaning you selectively use them to reward those who work for you or cooperate with you and punish those who do not. And particularly in a middle income country, where you don't have that, where media are often poor, where you don't have a really wealthy private sector, where a lot of citizens are struggling day to day, when the state is actively working for one side and benefiting those who work for the government and punishing those who do not work for the government, it creates very powerful incentives for companies, for media firms, and for citizens to silence themselves, to not engage in politics, or even to work for the government. Now, the thing about the United States is we're a lot richer. We're a lot richer, obviously, than any country in Latin America. We're a lot richer than Hungary. And so our civil society, our private sector, we have several hundred billionaires. We have more than, I think I'm getting this right, more than 20 million millionaires in the United States. We have dozens of law firms that generate billions of dollars in revenue. Some of our media companies are struggling, but they have deep pockets. We have as about as difficult a civil society to buy off as any in the world. So that gives us, our civil society, a lot of muscle to push back against Trump. It should be a lot harder to effectively tilt the playing field in the United States than it was in Hungary, and even more so than in most of Latin America, which suggests to me that our civil society has been punching below its weight in the first 6 months. Jeff Bezos, no personal disrespect intended, didn't need to take a knee. Paramount, major law firms, major universities, CEOs in the United States have deep enough pockets where they can resist and survive. And they have largely, not entirely, but largely chosen not to. And that, I think, has a lot, that's the difference between the United States and, say, Venezuela. That it's in a relatively poor society with a big active state. It's pretty easy for the state to impose itself on society. It should be a lot harder in the United States. And the fact that it's been relatively, surprisingly easygoing for Trump so far in the first 6 months suggests that our private sector, our media sector, and much of our civil society is either miscalculating or insufficiently interested in defending our democracy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I may have a slightly different take on the state of resistance in the U.S. Just to say, I agree. It hasn't been to the level and the actors taking active public actions to resist what the regime has been doing, and at the same time, I would say that the level of protest and dissent around the country is quite high. There are about 3 times the level of protests that have happened over the past 3 months compared to the same period of time 8 years ago under the first Trump administration. And what's most remarkable is that the protests are not just happening in blue or liberal areas, they're happening in red areas. People in Republican town halls are speaking out, being arrested for civil disobedience because of X, Y, and Z. And we're starting to see non-cooperation. We were talking earlier, and this gets to the point, Gábor, about talking about what can we do about this, and where do we draw signs of hope in terms of how people around the world have fought authoritarianism. And one thing that the research of popular movements against autocracy around the world has shown is that, yes, we need mass diverse participation. So all the groups you mentioned, Steve, the faith actors, the businesses, the unions, the workers, veterans groups, they all need to be part of an active team democracy, pro-democratic coalition. the protests matter, the marches, the demonstrations. I think the No Kings demonstration in this country had like 5 million people, which is not insignificant, but of course need a much larger show of force. But a key element of successful campaigns targeting autocracy is when people stop complying. And when organizations and institutions stop cooperating. That may mean workers restricting labor going on strike. That may mean consumer boycotts. That may mean, teachers who refuse to take down signs, everyone welcome here, and that spreads to the whole community. So law firms that say we're not going to bend the knee, and we're going to win contracts because we didn't bend the knee. And so I think the challenge is, how do we multiply and connect these various forms of non-compliance and non-cooperation that are happening across the country, which takes time, which takes relationship building, which takes relational organizing. And these are the things that don't happen overnight. But this is the work now. And I completely agree that this is the work for civil society now. But Gábor, I wanted to hear from you when you think about kind of effective pushback against authoritarianism, whether in Hungary or other places around the world. And I'm thinking Poland, the broad-based coalition that came together to push back against the Law and Justice Party. What gives you hope right now around the world?
Let me go back just a little bit to the previous round, because it had a fascinating component, and I just like to unpack it a little bit. Because one of the things that I've been hearing is from what Steve was saying, is talking just about the media, is how some owners are willing to, business is business. We're doing business and make compromises. And that's something I can talk about it also in the language of how to push back. But first you need to recognize what not to do. And what not to do is people with money, business elites, doing business with these autocrats. And that happens, unfortunately, too frequently. We see this in the United States, and we saw this in Hungary. The way he bought media was not just financially bankrupting Hungarian middle-class citizens who own media outlets, but also wealthy German investors who were willing to say, okay, I just sell you this because I don't care. It's just like I make profit by that. And that was a huge part of the game. But an even bigger part is what made the regime financially viable for a long time is the happiness of not just German, but mostly German. Hungary has a lot of German investors. And how transnational companies, because labor repression, because low costs, the repression of trade unions, it's just a great country to invest in and manufacture cars. And they were willing to put pressure on German political elites, especially the CDU, the German Conservative Party, for 10 years, was not willing to go against Orbán, because we know that the alliance between German businesses, German CDU is strong, so they were reluctant to go against that. So that's a very, very big part of the problem. There were a few businessmen who pushed back, but unfortunately not enough. Now this is changing, luckily. But I think this is something that we need to understand. In democracy research, there is this often misunderstood phrase, no bourgeoisie, no democracy, which is often interpreted as, businesses are natural allies of the rule of law. Some cases they are, but in some cases they are just ready to make deals in the name of profit and business. And I think that's a big problem, and we need to kind of face that, and we need more courageous businessmen who don't bend the knee. And now that's kind of more happening in Hungary. There's a change, and in part that has to do because financially Orbán has lost the viability of Orbánomics is not there anymore. The country has been stagnating for 3 years now economically, and you have an increasing number of also businesses who are willing to finance an opposition challenger. Of course, there's many more things happening at the same time. I was talking about businesses now, so this is the aspect that I wanted to highlight. Now, if you want to, we can continue also.
Well, how do we incentivize courage, right? So you're saying we need more business people that take a stand. In Hungary, one of the most active groups are teachers, and the teachers, the Tani Tenek, the movement, I Wish to Teach, which is opening up civic space. So how do we support, encourage key pillars of support to be courageous, to take a stand? What does that look like?
Well, I'm coming from a country that doesn't offer that many positive examples, but certainly you're right that for example, teachers, both in Hungary, but especially in the United States, have done some very, very important work in that regard. And it takes a degree of courage, but also like long-term vision to recognize the benefits of a democratic system. Because it's easy to say that in an autocracy, if I make my compromise, I can at least get by. And you need to be able to look beyond that and see kind of why it also makes sense financially to have a democracy. It's not just about your dignity and fundamental rights and things like that, but that in the long term, it's also like more viable for businesses to have a responsive government that is not completely despotic and driven by the whims of the leader. You need a kind of leadership and foresight for that and learning. So I think that's part of the story.
Yep.
Can I say something in response?
Yep.
This point that it's important to learn the value of democracy, I think, speaks to something important, which is I have no idea how to incentivize courage. If I knew how to incentivize courage, I would have a much better paying job. But where you do see civil society quick to respond is almost invariably a country with some collective memory of authoritarianism. Whether it's Brazil or Argentina or Chile or South Korea or Spain or Germany, societies with an either recent memory of authoritarianism or which have invested in remembering the way the Germans have, are much quicker off the mark. And that's my great concern with the United States, is that outside of some immigrants and African Americans, nobody in the very few people in the United States, very few elites, have any memory of what it is like to lose or not have a democracy. And I think most of our elites, including very well-educated, well-informed elites, still believe to this day, in July 2025, that it can't really happen here. And that's slowing the response.
Yeah. I want to turn it to have a few minutes for question and answer from the audience, but I would say to that point, I think leaning into our own history of authoritarianism in this country is very, very important. And lessons from the civil rights movement, probably our greatest pro-democracy movement, the context was different. It was authoritarianism at the subnational level, authoritarian enclaves. But I think there are so many lessons from that period that are very relevant to our current context of federal authoritarianism. And one of the most important lessons is the mass nonviolent resistance campaigns that essentially dismantled racial apartheid in the South. And it was about noncompliance. It was about the lunch counter sit-ins that went after white-owned businesses. It was about the Montgomery bus boycott that raised the economic costs of authoritarianism in the South. It was the civil disobedience. And I think those lessons of how to support and inculcate those types of strategies and tactics now is, again, part of where the work is at in the United States. So I don't know if you want to respond to that. We can.
Well, really quickly, I hate to be overly pessimistic, but our institutions are so busy today complying with government efforts to erase the most democratic parts of our history. This country is phenomenally good at whitewashing its authoritarian past. Yes. Right? You talk to average Americans, they have no idea how, why, and to what extent Reconstruction was derailed in the United States. They know very little about the struggle for civil rights in the United States. Most Americans don't know that we didn't become a full democracy until 1965.
That's right.
And we are in the middle. Universities, wealthy, powerful, prominent universities are tripping over themselves today to comply with dismantling DEI, with dismantling not tenuring professors who work on this stuff. We are far from a place of not complying with authoritarian initiatives in the United States.
Yep. We are far from there, but fortunately we have lessons that we can learn, yes. So I think we have about 14 or so minutes to take some questions from the audience. There are 2 mics on either side, so if folks have a question, please fire away.
Good to see you, Maria. Thank you. My name is Reverend Adam Taylor. I lead an organization called Sojourners. First, I just want to thank you for making that historical point. I think there's a lot that we can and need to learn from the civil rights movement and more. My question is both, what can we learn from Hungary and other countries about the role of courage, if you will, from within the party that the authoritarian is leading? And, you know, call me naive, but maybe I did have a little more hope that we would see more profiles of courage within the Republican Party. I understand the degree to which President Trump has consolidated his power with that party. But, you know, we have seen literally Congress just give away its power, the Republican-controlled Congress, most recently through the rescission vote. And I'm wondering, are there more things that we could be learning from elsewhere about how to incentivize or cajole courage from Republicans to be willing to either resist or defy or defect? And I understand, you know, how hard that is, but again, I think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
It's a great question, and especially given our duopoly, it makes it even more difficult to bring about those kinds of changes. But Stephan or Gábor, would you like to take that one?
Really quickly, I shared, and I guess continue to share your hope that, because that Trump could be constrained in a matter of hours if even a fraction of the Republican Party, beginning in the legislature, of course, were to draw a line. And the personal control over the party has occurred very, very quickly. When I wrote How Democracies Die 7 years ago, there was still a McCain faction in the Republican Party that looked like it was both willing and able to constrain Trump, and that's gone. Unfortunately, Gábor may have some more answers. I don't have a lot of examples of intra-party resistance. There is the historical example, somewhat misremembered, of Nixon. It was only really pretty late in the game that Republicans drew a line in the case of Nixon, but particularly in presidential democracies. And we saw this Biden too. It's really hard in a presidential democracy for a party to constrain a sitting president. It's a little easier in parliamentary democracies, and for that, I'll turn things to Gábor.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, a very good question. Ideally, it would be nice to have democratic systems where conservative elites say there's a red line and we don't tolerate this kind of politics. But I just don't see that happening too often, not just among conservatives. In general, if you have a political party in power and a style of politics that appears to pay off electorally, there's just like very little incentives to go against it. And what we see is more like these systems or parties start to kind of leak or crumble once the whole regime starts to crumble. And also there's a chance of losing power because there's like organized opposition. So yes, on one hand, it would be nice to find ways to encourage Republicans or whatever political parties outside the US to restrain their own illiberal leaders. But I would say the main thrust of democratic energies should go towards kind of winning elections against these political forces so that it doesn't pay off electorally to follow this kind of politics. And that will need a kind of democratic vision that addresses some of the problems which make this kind of illiberal style of politics appear to be successful or appealing electorally. I'm not saying it's giving like in any way a viable solution, but it's answering some legitimate questions. So I think that's how I would reframe your question, if that makes sense.
Right. Thanks, Gábor. Over here.
Hi, Brett Davidson from the International Resource for Impact and Storytelling. Thanks very much for raising this question of courage, because it's something that I've been grappling with, and particularly why does it seem that the institutions, the organizations with the most amount of money and legal power seem to be the ones who have the least amount of courage, whereas regular people seem to be showing the courage. So that's a question I have. But also then I think another thing to think about is solidarity, because I think, well, how do you develop solidarity so that you're not having to show courage alone, but you're doing it together? And I think it seems to me that if people and organizations united, it would be so much easier. But how do we develop that sense of solidarity? I think particularly in a country where individualism is such an entrenched kind of thing in the culture. Thank you.
So incentivizing solidarity and getting to collective action, which is the name of the game for effectively resisting authoritarianism.
Those are great questions. I initially came at, even if you'd asked me 6 or 9 months ago, I was still relatively optimistic about the United States in the medium run, but the reasons for my optimism was precisely because we had so many institutions and organizations with a lot of resources. We are as endowed as any society on earth to fight back, to have the courage to, if you have Jeff Bezos' wealth, it's pretty easy, should be pretty easy to be courageous. Harvard should be able to be courageous. Columbia should be able to be courageous. Compare that to public universities in Mexico or Nicaragua or El Salvador. And yet, exactly right. It is individual citizens who've shown courage, and most of our most powerful institutions and CEOs and others have not. And I think the answer is folks have gotten pretty accustomed to living well and enjoying a lot of power and privilege, and don't want to risk it. It's really hard to be, I wouldn't know personally, but it's really hard to be courageous when you might lose that private jet. I'm only half facetious there. It turns out that the wealthy have a hard time finding courage, even though they've got the means to do it. And I think you're right about collective solidarity. Pre-existing organizations, I mean, it's true we've got a culture of individualism that doesn't help. We also lack many institutions and organizations of collective action. Our labor movement is weak compared to Western Europe and even parts of Latin America. We do not have many encompassing business or rural or religious organizations that can facilitate collective action. We have some, but as far as Western democracies go, the United States does not have many encompassing organizations of collective action. So it's got to be, as Maria said, kind of a slow bottom-up process. And I think it will happen, but it's going to be slower.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add
Yes.
one thing very, very briefly? I think if you look at the history of democratization, there is a factor that tends to get neglected, and that is, in many cases, the biggest advances in democracy came from masses organizing against the collusion between economic and political elites. And once you lose that kind of ability of masses to organize and force economic and political elites to compromise, that's when democracy gets into really big trouble. So in my reading of the history of democracy, it is not really something that elites were giving to people. It was always something that people who had nothing to lose and who had really difficult times every day, they were demanding things and using democracy to fight for institutions, to redistribute wealth, to give them opportunities, to share the wealth that otherwise political and economic elites would just like to keep to themselves, right? So I think it's very good to try to push economic and political elites with a lot of resources to push back, because they have the resources to do so. But history tells us that really democracy's biggest allies are the organized masses who demand dignity and who demand a kind of caring and inclusive democracy. So I think this is what we need to remember.
I couldn't agree more on the role of mass mobilization and kind of people power movements. And some of you may be familiar with the statistics born of the research from Why Civil Resistance Works, which is that no regime has remained in power when 3.5% of the population has engaged in active protest, which seems like a small number. In the US, it's about 11 million people. But the point there is that it takes mass mobilization by diverse parts of society, diverse sectors, pillars, communities, to be able to shift elite incentives. And often elites will follow where the mass pressure, and it's not just pressure, and don't let me exaggerate saying it's just protest, non-cooperation. It's also dialogue with people within these pillars. It's actively organizing with people within faith, within unions, within business, so that they are prepared to eventually engage in non-cooperation. But just to say, I thoroughly agree on the kind of mass people power front. Please.
Yes, my name is Justin Hansford. I am director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. Most of the conversation has focused on domestic sectors, and I was interested in some of the global possibilities, and was wondering, in your research, have you seen global pressure result in effective anti-authoritarian movements? I was thinking about South Africa and the fight for democracy there in the 1990s and 1980s, 1970s. And I'm wondering what sort of factors would lead some of these global movements to be successful, and is that possible here?
Yes.
Do you want to?
I've got to take that maybe different from others. I tend to focus more on states than movements. There was a time, and South Africa benefited from this, with the end of the Cold War, beginning mid-1980s, all the way through the first decade of the 21st century, basically a 15 to 20 year period in the late 20th, early 21st century, when the liberal West, basically the United States and the European Union, were the only game in town. They were the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological power. And during that period, without any serious threats from China or Russia, the Soviet Union, they promoted democracy fairly consistently, not perfectly consistently, but that was the most energetic period of Western democracy promotion, both from governments and from civil society in the United States. And during that period, that's when you see the greatest expansion of democracy in the history of the world. You had very strong external pressures for democracy, punishing authoritarian governments and supporting democracy movements between the mid-late 1980s and the early 2000s. Unfortunately, with the geopolitical changes of the last 20 years, where the West has declined, and you see the rise of China and a more aggressive Russia, the balance of power is such that liberal Western dominance is gone, and I think unlikely to return. And I think it's less likely, not to say we shouldn't support it, but it's less likely that you're going to see such overwhelming external force on behalf of Democrats.
And for what it's worth, South Africa, Chile, Austria, Pinochet, Polish solidarity, the most recent cases in South Korea. So when martial law was declared at the end of last year, the mass public mobilization that involved labor unions, faith groups, opposition politicians, young kids with K-pop sticks, mass mobilization that uses diverse tactics, including non-cooperation, and that brings about loyalty shifts in key pillars upholding regimes, tend to be the campaigns that are most successful in context of democratic backsliding and authoritarian rise. So that's all the more reason why we need to be learning from all of these cases around the world. And I'm thinking most recently of Brazil and the pushback against Bolsonaro, of France, the coalition that electorally defeated the far right. We need to continue to understand those strategies and tactics. Last question, please.
All right, great conversation. Rob Ritchie ran Fair Vote for many years and now run a group called Expand Democracy. But I've been a reformer in the United States, and the basic experience has been challenges democratizing the United States beyond where we've been. I feel we had gotten very stale. The democratic muscles had been weakened. You think about some of our state legislatures, they don't have Orban, but they have people very much like them running it for 30, 40 years as speakers of the House and so on. And there was sort of an acceptance of huge money in politics and electoral college and winner-take-all elections and two-party entrenched system and so on. And it feels that that created the climate of lack. So winning isn't taking us back. Preserving democracy needs to be a more forward-looking agenda. And I'm just wondering if there's a set of practices, if you think of, say, Western Europe or countries that are maybe prophylactically doing more to prevent this, whether there's some lessons for a country like the United States that we need to be more aggressive in what we do positively than we have been doing for a long time.
Great. And so we'll end with that question. Gábor, on the positive agenda and how to be proactive.
Yeah, I think based on what I know about what European countries are able to cope better with this kind of authoritarian populist challenge, a few of the things that stand out is Nordic social democracies generally have they have right-wing populist challengers, but they tend to be more on the middle end. These are some of the most cohesive societies on earth, a very relatively low level of inequality, more kind of tamed economic elites. Of course, that model is crumbling, but it's an important part of the system, and this leads majority of population still having trust in democracy as a system that works for the people, that it's not a system that has been hijacked by elites, and I think that's a crucial part of it. And then you can see this in some other countries, in Spain, Portugal, the southern part of Europe, has also this kind of elements that manage to pull off, like centrist, center-left parties manage to be able to represent themselves as parties and movements of the people that manage states, that democratic states that work for the people. So I would emphasize this as a closing remark, that we need to have democracies where the majorities of people feel at home. And they feel that democracy and democratic institutions care for them, because that's when they're going to care for democracy also.
Great, thank you, Gábor. Steve, I'll give you the last word.
Really quickly to reinforce Gábor's point, we have the difficult task of doing two things at once. There is an imminent threat, a short-term threat, certainly in the United States, of an authoritarian government, and we need to talk about strategies to fend off that authoritarian offensive. But there's also this medium and long-term challenge of building a democracy that is more legitimate and more accessible to citizens, and it's difficult to do both. And I think a lot of people, and I'm at the top of this list, who have been running around screaming about defending democracy over the last decade. We've gotten very conservative, very small c conservative, in the sense of we want to preserve the 20th and often 19th century institutions that existed a decade or 20 years ago. And that's a hell of a lot better than where we are today, but it's clearly not enough, as both Maria and Gábor said. So we need to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to think about strategies for defending democracy now, and that involves broad coalitions and mobilization and the kinds of strategies that Maria is talking about. But we must, at the same time, not be content with just restoring Obama-era democracy. It's not going to be enough.
Great. Completely agree. So thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, Gábor, and thanks to you all for your great questions.